culture is made up of people. And so the way that we are within ourselves, if we're aware of our own power and we're aware of where we lack power, and then we're aware of that in relationship with others, and then we're aware of that in relationship with institutions, then we really start to shift the world, both inside and around us.
Hey everyone, I'm Thais Sky. Welcome to Reclaim, a podcast for women by women on conversations that matter. Hello, all of you beautiful people. Welcome to Reclaim the podcast. I have to say, as we are slowly nearing the end of Season 2, I am just continually taken aback by all of the amazing feedback I've received from you all about the podcast. I started this podcast in 2017 as a desire to continue to share my thoughts with the world and have guests on that I felt really connected with. And the result has been just this amazing, thriving community of people who are continually sharing with me how much the guests that I have on are just doing something to their souls, And I've also received so much great feedback about the podcast where I answer your questions, or the Worthy Women Rise series, the worthiness series, that I typically do in honor of the launch of Worthy Women Rise. So I've just been getting so much good feedback, and I'm so endlessly appreciative for all of you who have shared the podcast, who have told your friends about the podcast, who have told me how much the podcast has meant something to you. I really, really appreciate those things because in the back end here, I'm just speaking into a mic and I don't know who's listening and I don't know what it's doing out in the world. And so getting that feedback, it means everything to me. And as we end Season 2, we're going to be going on about a 6-week hiatus before the launch of Season 3. You all have been giving me so many things to think about in terms of how I can make the podcast even better and better. So a couple things. If you don't support this podcast on Patreon, I really would appreciate it. I don't make any money off of the podcast because I don't want there to be advertisement on the podcast, and maybe that will change in the future. But right now I feel really, really committed that I don't want capitalism to be here too. We are already inundated with capitalism, with advertisements, with people promoting their stuff, their products onto us again and again and again. And I just want this to be a space free from that. So I don't make money from advertisements, which means this podcast is a love project that I put out into the world. So if you like the podcast and you want to see it keep going, if you want it to be sustainable, please consider supporting the podcast on Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/ThaisSky and learn more. Even just $1 can go a long way. Right now I have an editor. I would love to have more people on this podcast to support its growth, to have even more amazing guests on. Please consider giving even just $1 to this podcast. It makes a huge difference. And I'm going to be doing, of course, more answering your questions on air. So if you have a question for me, please email me at info@thaissky.com. Ask me anything that's on your heart. Ask me something that you've been navigating that you're not sure how to think about it or how to conceptualize it or what to do about it. And I will be happy to share my thoughts here on air with you. So you can email me at info@thaissky.com. So here's a question I received from one of you. You've asked, if we are feeling a bit cut off from our feelings and know rationally or say to ourselves rationally, I am worthy, how do we actually feel it to be true? So I asked to give me a little bit more context. And she said, well, for me personally, I disengage or numb out a lot to cope. It feels too tiring to be fully present all day. So I can lose that sense of I am, or the inner dialogue that lets you know you are here. Sometimes we can hear something and be inspired in our mind, but it doesn't connect our whole body. So what are some ways we can connect to our body when understanding our worth? Oh, that is such a beautiful question from Sinking Into Body. Okay, Sinking Into Body. Let's talk about this. Your question, I believe, extends beyond how do I feel worthy in my body? And I think the real question here is, how do I feel? Because feeling is a body experience. We don't feel mentally. We feel by being in our bodies. Our emotion expresses itself through our body. And so feeling worthy, feeling anything comes from our body. When we are deeply disconnected from our body, we're not actually feeling anything. Now, the reason why we disconnected from our bodies is, well, there are many reasons. One of the reasons is it could be because we were taught when we were little that feelings were unsafe, that feelings led us to doing things that we would get in trouble for, that we can't really trust our feelings. And there's a multitude of ways that we may have been gaslit by our parents, unintentionally, right? It's not like they intentionally wanted us to disconnect from our feelings. It's that we live in a emotions phobic culture. And I talk a lot about this on my Instagram. So you can all go check out my Instagram at I am Thais Sky. I talk a lot about feelings. I talk a lot about disconnect because for so many of us, we were told that our feelings were bad. And living in a culture where our feelings are bad, it's no wonder our parents taught us that. Our parents, in many ways, are a product of our culture, okay? So if we were told as a child that our feelings are bad, and or if we had an experience in childhood where we were in a state of trauma and the feelings that came with that trauma were so overwhelming, one of the few tools that we have as children is this idea of dissociating, of completely disconnecting ourselves from our body. Now, the dissociation that I'm talking about is really a very specific experience of being out of our body. So it's almost like we can look down and we can see ourselves, we can see the perpetrator doing what it's doing, but we are completely removed from our body. That's the true dissociation. And that's a protective mechanism, one of the few that we have as children, to kind of diminish the hurt, to diminish the pain, to diminish the overwhelm that we were experiencing at that time. Now as adults, dissociation may still be happening for those of us who have deep complex trauma, for those of us who have experienced trauma in adulthood. That's a very fair and valid way that we cope with trauma. But now what happens is we typically dissociate in a much smaller way, which is really we're just disconnected from our bodies. And that's where you found me throughout my early 20s, completely disconnected from my body. In fact, I felt that my body was something to be just dealt with, something really annoying that I just had to deal with in order for me to live. But I believe that my worth was located in my head, in my brain, and that I could intellectualize everything, right? That my smarts, that my understanding of the world was what was going to save me. So for many of us, we've disconnected from our bodies, and we did that because our body is connected to our emotions, and our emotions are uncomfortable. We weren't taught how to deal with them. I often talk about in Worthy Women Rise how the language of emotions is like any other language. It requires us to learn it. We wouldn't just go into a different country and expect ourselves to know that language just by shooting ourselves, right? We would have to get books. We would have to learn what those language is, compare it to what we know, and find a way to learn that language based on our own past experience. Well, the same thing goes for emotions. Emotions speak to us in its own language. It's always communicating something to us. But because we don't, for most of us, know the language of emotions, we kind of write off emotions as something to just deal with, as something that's uncomfortable, as a part of the human experience that we try to ignore. And so for many of us who are disconnected from our bodies, we're disconnected from our emotions for a very good reason. Because we were taught that our emotions are bad. And now the idea of emotions feels really overwhelming and we don't know where to start. We don't know how to be in our bodies because our body is so foreign. This is augmented, of course, by our fat-phobic society that tells us that if we are not in a physical body that looks a certain way, then we're bad, we're wrong, right? We live in a society that tells us that our body is meant to be consumed by others. And so we have to eat and diet and exercise in a specific way so that our body looks a certain way so that we can be consumable, so that we can be seen as acceptable in our society. And so that makes it even more difficult for us to be in our body, particularly if we're in a body that is further away from what's culturally acceptable. Right? So if we exist in this body that we've been told all our lives is bad and it's wrong because it's not skinny, it's not a certain weight, it doesn't look this way, then we can definitely internalize this sense that our body is unsafe, our body is bad. Okay? So there's multiple reasons why we've disconnected from our bodies and they are all valid. But what I'm hearing from sinking into body is a desire to start to undo that, right? To unlearn that. And here's some of my thoughts. First off, in order to unlearn that, it's important for us to recognize that we have to go slow. Because if we've been told all our lives that our body is bad, our feelings are bad, then just expecting us to be able to now fully embrace our emotions, fully embrace our body, it doesn't look that way. It doesn't work that way. It's going to take time. It's going to take time to learn how to cultivate trust in our bodies, just like it takes time to cultivate trust in anybody. Right? It takes time. And so expecting us to go from completely disconnected to our feelings to now suddenly feeling worthy, it's just not going to happen. Okay? It's going to take time. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because you're laying a strong foundation of trust. Okay. Number 2. One of the things that Sinking in Your Body said in her question is this idea that it feels too tiring to be fully present all day. And, I think that that's kind of an unrealistic expectation that we carry. Once we start to kind of dive into the self-development world, we think, oh, okay, the goal is to be present all the time. If I can be present all the time, then I'll be able to deal with anything that comes our way. But that's not how our mind works, right? Our mind is constantly in the future and constantly in the past. It's just going forward, back all the time. Our mind is a little Riley, like a little wild, right? Focusing on being present all the time is actually a way that we dishonor how our mind works. I don't think the answer is to be present all the time. I think the invitation is to, whenever we recognize that we are disconnected, anytime we recognize that we are in anxiety, anytime that we recognize that we are in depression, is to see what is happening in the moment. What is happening here? It's not about forcing ourselves to always be present. It's about bringing ourselves back to presence with grace. Does that make sense? We're going to be living in this world that is future-oriented and past-oriented. But whenever we can recognize that we are in anxiety, that we are sad, that we are experiencing an emotion, seeing if we can come into it with grace, see if we can honor that we've left and come back gently, and then know that we will leave again. I sometimes think that we try to stay present because it's a way that we can control, right? And the ways that we want to control our lives are so insidious, but they are everywhere. And so being mindful not to use trying to be present as just another way that we're trying to control our human experience, because our human experience is inherently uncontrollable, but that's okay. There are ways that we can find pockets of control that feel good, that don't feel rigid, that feels like it allows our wholeness to enter. Okay, so number 3, how do we connect with our whole body when understanding our worth? Again, I think what we're really asking here is how do we just be in our bodies? Because when we are in our bodies, we start to cultivate worth, right? Cultivating worth is the process of developing self-trust. And so the more that we can come back to our bodies and expand our capacity to be with whatever is coming up in our body, that's how we start to develop self-trust. Versus every time we leave ourselves, every time we try to deny our experience, every time we're intellectualizing or we're in our mind or we are shoulding our experience as opposed to being here, we are dehumanizing ourselves, right? Every time we're comparing ourselves to others, having a hard time on accepting what is here. These are all ways that we are insidiously dehumanizing ourselves. Okay, so what are some ways that we can connect to our body? Well, this is, I think, a question that we each get to explore. Something that I like to ask is, well, what activities that you do you feel deeply in your body? You know, for some of us, it's physical movement. It's something like swimming or running or yoga. You know, I invite then, if we're doing physical activity, to bring ourselves into our bodies, that we try to do it without distraction. If we're running on the treadmill, try to remove the TV and the music. See if you can really connect with your body. Right? See if you can notice yourself sweating, notice your heart beating, notice, the muscles moving in your body, right? If you're doing something like yoga, see if you can continue to bring your breath into your body. If movement-based isn't exciting to you or isn't possible for you, there are so many other ways. Breath work is a beautiful way that we can deepen into our body. Just committing to spending a few moments every morning taking some deep breaths. If that's not available or of interest to you, meditation is a great way that we can bring into our bodies. I have a meditation on my website for how to do a body scan meditation. Body scan meditations are amazing ways that we can deepen into our body, right? So there's so many ways that we can kind of start to sink into the feelings in our body. I highly recommend the book, The Body Keeps Score by Bessel van der Kolk. This is a book that I recommend to my clients all the time, particularly those who have experienced trauma in childhood, which we now are naming as complex trauma. Or complex PTSD, depending on the symptoms that you're having. But the book is a beautiful guide to how to go into your body and the importance of going into your body, right? And he talks about top up regulation and top down, or bottom up regulation and top down regulation, which is how do we calm our automatic nervous system? And again, breath work, meditation, all of these are beautiful ways that studies are showing, something that we've already inherently known, that mindfulness helps us to integrate the two. And so we, while it may sound kind of overly simplistic in some ways, mindfulness, the fact of the matter is it really does work. It really does help. The other thing that I talk about in Worthy Women Rise in terms of how to expand our capacity to be with our emotions is understanding the language of emotions. And one of the things that we can do is just start to write a journal of how do you feel? Okay, I feel happy. And then how does that feel in your body? How do you know that that's happiness? Start to learn how your body communicates different emotions to you. When you're feeling unsafe, when you're feeling traumatized, when you're feeling sad, when you're feeling depressed, when you're feeling anxious, how does that feel in your body? Continually bringing ourselves back to our body. How does it feel? Where does it feel? Can I just be with this? Can I honor that this is what it is? These are some ways that we can expand our capacity to learn the language of emotions. But again, we have to put on the learning cap. If we are constantly believing that we are doing it wrong or we are wrong, as opposed to getting curious, then we're going to try to shut down this experience. I think that in so many ways, we've forgotten how to learn. We kind of navigate our lives believing that we have to now be the master. And we've forgotten that there's a beautiful human experience that comes when we are open to just learning, to not knowing. And so use this experience of deepening into your emotions, deepening into your body as a learning. Yeah? Now, one final thing that sinking into your body mentioned is that sometimes she can lose this sense of I am. And this is something that resonates a lot with me. Oftentimes people who believe that they don't need emotions, or they try to intellectualize emotions, those are the ones who are typically the most disconnected from their emotions, and their emotions scare them the most, which is why they use intellectualization, which is why they use mentalization or being in their minds, right? So this idea of losing the sense of I am often comes because we weren't reflected as children a mirror of who we are. And there's a beautiful thing that happens when we're consistently mirrored in childhood. We start to see yes, I am here. And we do this mirroring through many different ways, or we ask to be mirrored, in many different ways as children. Sometimes we're just like, Mommy, hey, Mom, Mommy. And every time she's like, yes, dear, yes, yes. How can I help you? What's going on? Yes, yes. And you keep saying, Mommy. And the mom responds, yes. And then finally she's like, what? What do you want? And the child goes, nothing, right? Has anyone ever had that experience? What is that that's happening? The child is asking the parent to be mirrored. What the child is saying every time the child is calling out to her mom is saying, am I here? Do I exist? Is this a thing? Am I human? Am I here? And every time the mother says, you're here, I see you, I'm hearing you, I'm responding to you, you're here, the child grows up believing that they have the right to exist. Now, the problem is the majority of us, well, maybe not the majority, but I know many of us weren't necessarily given that type of mirroring. We had parents who were busy, who were working. We had parents who were in their own world, dealing with their own experiences. And even though they did the best that we could, and we can so honor and appreciate that they did the best that they could, if we missed that mirroring, then it's inevitable that as adults, we kind of have a lost sense of who we are. Sometimes we either don't have a sense of who we are at all, where we're not grounded in reality, and that typically leads to more severe mental illnesses, or in a less severe form, we just sometimes get lost. We sometimes are like, wait, who am I? Right? We feel disoriented. This is normal. This is a normal part of not being mirrored. And now we get to mirror ourselves. Now we get to be there for ourselves. And we do that through this concept of self-parenting. And I've talked about self-parenting before. I believe it was one of the worthiness series episodes. It's either 6, 7, or 8. I would go back if this is of interest to you. But now we have an opportunity to do things differently with ourselves. And this is the best part about the work that I do and about the world of coaching and therapy and mental health and self-development, is that it is inherent in it that change is possible for all of us. So I love the question Sinking in Your Body asked me, how do we feel worthy? We feel worthy by opening ourselves up to feeling all of our emotions, and by not judging our emotions. And the more that we can expand our capacity to be with our emotions, the more we develop a sense of trust in ourselves and this deep sense that we are worthy of being here, that we are worthy of existing. Okay, so again, love answering these questions. Keep sending them my way. You can email them to me. You can send it through an Instagram direct message. There are so many ways you can get in contact with me. I'm happy to continue answering your questions. I have so many thoughts and I would love to share them with you. And sometimes through answering questions, it's the best way that I can do that. But for now, I want to bring Susanna on. So in this episode, Susanna and I talk about yoga and the ways that we can navigate yoga with cultural appropriation, and how, as you know, people in the Western society, you know, what can we do to appreciate the lineage of yoga while also understanding cultural appropriation? And this is something that I've talked about before in the podcast. I talked a little bit about it with Jessamine. I talked about it before with some other guests who are not coming in my mind right this moment. So this is a conversation that I've had before, because I think we have to keep having it. And I think everybody has a slightly different perspective. And I think all these perspectives kind of can then help us create our own way of navigating the world. Okay. So Susanna Barkataki is here with us, and she helps yoga teachers, studios, nonprofits, and businesses become leaders in equity, diversity, and yogic values so they embody thriving yoga leadership with integrity and confidence. She's the founder of Ignite Yoga and Wellness Institute, training in India, an honors in BA from UC Berkeley, and a yoga therapist and Ayurvedic practitioner. Okay, and Susanna supports clients in integrating equity with yoga and wellness. So you can learn more about her at susannabarkataki.com. And Susanna led this amazing yoga summit. And it was just, the speakers that she had and the conversations that she had were just beautiful. So I highly recommend following Susanna on Instagram. She's going to be doing a challenge, and she talks a little bit about it in the interview. She's going to do a challenge to kind of see if we can invite yoga in a different way online on Instagram. Yeah. So as you're listening to this conversation, I want you to be thinking about your own relationship with yoga, and what does it look like for you to appreciate yoga while also recognizing its roots and recognizing the ways that the Western world has damaged yoga in some ways, and how the Western world has helped yoga be the movement that it is, and what our role in that is, and what do we want our relationship to yoga to be. Hello, Susanna. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Me too. I love the work that you're doing in the world. It is something that I think is so needed, and I can't wait to dive into it. But before we do that, I know that you made a request for how you want us to start, and I want to honor that request. So you want to lead us?
I would love to lead us. So as I mentioned to you, I'm naturally shy, and one of the tools that I use to help me whenever I'm talking to anyone, whether that's one person or groups of people, is to do a little bit of guided meditation. And so I wanted to invite us to do that together. So wherever you are, and for listeners, wherever you are, you can take a moment, and if it's comfortable and safe, ground down so you can connect to your seat. If you're walking, keep walking, connect to your feet, keep your eyes open if you're driving, and connect to your breath. And we'll take a deep breath in through our noses and then release through our mouth. And we'll do that 2 more times. Inhale through the nose and exhale through the mouth with a sound. And once more. Coming into presence with this moment, aligning with our truth, ourselves, and one another. And I imagine this sacred circle of all of us listening at different times and places, sharing our voices and connecting through this amazing medium and platform that you've created. So thank you for doing that little grounding with me.
Thank you. That was really nice. I needed that. So thank you.
You're so welcome. Me too.
So what really attracted me to your work is, the concepts that you're putting out into the world around decolonizing yoga. And you created a yoga summit, or a summit called Honor, Don't Appropriate Yoga Summit. And I would love to hear a little bit about how that summit went. What was the thoughts around the summit? And like, what was the biggest learning that you had around the summit?
Yes. Okay. So, wow. The summit had been a long time coming. I've been mulling over in this world of yoga and wellness why we don't have more teachers and leaders of color. And then in particular, the conspicuous absence of South Asian yoga teachers. It's like, this is where the teachings come from. Like for me, when I studied Ayurveda, my teachers were Indian. When I went to India and stayed and traveled and studied, my teachers were Indian, right? Yoga comes from a place and a people. And yet you wouldn't know it from yoga in the West. You know that from yoga in Yoga Journal, in, all the magazines. Like the image we think of when we think of yoga is a skinny, blonde, well outfitted in some kind of designer yoga clothes with a designer mat, right? And so I've been for so long really frustrated with that, because it didn't describe not only my experience, but felt like an affront to my heritage and my culture and roots. And so I've been on this journey of reclaiming, and I love that title of your podcast, because it really began, the summit began with me reclaiming what it is to honor yoga. And so I wanted to create a conversation that no one could ignore. So in the future, when someone's putting on a yoga summit or a yoga event, it would be, people would say, well, where are the Black folks? Where are the South Asian teachers? And that would just be a new starting point. That was the goal. And there were so many learnings as well. I think the biggest learning is that it's just the beginning, right? There's no way to do something so huge as host a conversation like that and address all the different nuances and all the different viewpoints. And I never said that I was, but people assume a lot more power, actually, and a lot more kind of like status than I felt like I had. I felt like I was an organizer coming in from the outside. And all of a sudden, I think after the summit was like, people were seeing me as the mainstream media, which was so interesting. And so I think there was a real shift in my awareness of my responsibility as well, to, when hosting these kinds of conversations, to continue to do the work of, well, who am I even leaving out, right? And initially, so I'll tell a really specific story and example. I was posting about the summit, sharing about all the amazing people who were on it and their different experiences. And it is a really diverse and unique lineup. And a few people messaged me and said, well, what about folks who are disabled, who are hard of hearing, or who need closed captions? What are you going to do about them? How are you going to make this summit accessible? You know, it's like honor yoga. How are you honoring yoga for folks who can't listen to your audios or watch your videos and understand it? And, you know, my initial thought was like, oh yeah, of course, that's a really important question. And I wrote back to a few people wrote me saying, I so hear you. You know, I myself have a disability, of physical disability of sight. I'm blind in one eye. And I know that this is an important topic and I want to make sure that I am inclusive. And right now, I don't know how I'm going to do that because it costs money to get closed captioning. And so they were understanding, you know, as of course you would be, but it was a real dilemma. And so I was searching, kind of soul searching, figuring like somehow I'm going to pull this together. And a few colleagues reached out and said, is there anything we can do to help you right now as you put this on? And I said, look, the thing I'm trying to do is get closed captioning. And so they connected me with Yoga Alliance, and Yoga Alliance jumped in and very generously offered to fund closed captioning. And so the summit was a totally grassroots effort, something that I just put together, but I was grateful to have support to then make it more accessible. And in the future, I would plan for that kind of accessibility from the beginning.
You had some really amazing speakers like Jessamine Stanley, you had Carrie Kelly, you had Kino McGregor, you had Rachel Bravin. I mean, these are people who are very kind of well known in the yoga communities. And I, you know, am curious to hear how, you know, what is the underlying consensus on how we can make yoga more inclusive and not as, you know, and decolonize, not as appropriated, not as harmful?
You know, the beautiful thing about the summit is that there really is no consensus. And I think we're in this moment of challenge and this moment of culture shift, which is, it really takes all of us. It's like, I think the consensus was, we're really clear about the problem the yoga world faces. And when I say the yoga world, I mean yoga in the West and those of us who engage with yoga practitioners, who are yoga teachers, even curious. You know, there's millions of us now across the world, and there have been for a long time, many folks in India. And I can't speak to the problems of yoga in India so much. I think that's a very different topic that is going on and is connected to a lot of geopolitical issues that impact us here in the West. But our problem here is really clear, which is, why participate and be complicit in a structure that we've set up that limits our ability to practice our true values? If yoga is unity, then why are we participating in a way where we are limiting our ability to contribute to and access and share that unity? And so as a community, as a yoga community, I think we're all struggling with that and working on that. And we're not alone, I think, is the first and most important thing. We are surrounded by one another and we're powerful. And so as we continue this inquiry of what does it look like to use the yoga that we practice to build inner power to shape outer change, we get to consult with one another, learn from one another, and really try to do a better job than we've been doing. So there wasn't a clear answer. You know, there were a lot of questions and a lot of inquiry. And to me, this is a really personally exciting time because it's like my life's work, being a mixed race child, being born of colonization, really, in England to British and Indian parents who would not have met were it not for what, colonization in India. It's been my life story to try to reconcile harm and healing and oppression and liberation. And so this is just another, in a way, it's almost like a liberation struggle that is taking the yoga world and our world in general, I think, by storm. It's like we're not willing to compromise anymore. We're not willing to just sit by and like have a shadow and an excuse of a practice. We all want, I think many of us want a really true practice of unity. We're just not always sure how.
Yeah. Well, and I think so many of us think that it's kind of for somebody else, that somebody else will take care of it. Someone else will do the whole diversity thing,
Right. Yeah.
And I think what your work is reminding all of us is that it's very much our issue. It's there. No one else is going to save us. And if we want yoga to continue to be this incredible, sustainable, nourishing container for our healing, it's got to be inclusive. It has to, or else it's not stable. It's not going to work.
Right. That's exactly it. And I love that you brought that up about feeling like it's someone else's job. I think, first of all, of course, it's all of our jobs. We're complicit in these structures and we support them just by our participation. And sometimes we feel as an individual that we lack power, but we actually are so powerful. But also, diversity or inclusivity isn't just a box to be checked or something to do to be on the right side of history, and it really is the way forward. And it's about changing culture, but culture is made up of people. And so the way that we are within ourselves, if we're aware of our own power and we're aware of where we lack power, and then we're aware of that in relationship with others, and then we're aware of that in relationship with institutions, then we really start to shift the world, both inside and around us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And would love to hear, Susanna, a little bit more about your story on how did you kind of get into this understanding of the inclusive nature of yoga? Like, how did this kind of pull towards doing this work? How did it happen for you?
I mean, right. Yeah. There's so many points of entry. And I think I've told the story a lot of being an immigrant kid into the United States and really struggling with a lot of racism and discrimination and not knowing quite who I was or where I was and where I belonged. So that certainly was the backdrop. But another piece of my story that I'm feeling called to share now is I was right after I went through, and I had a very challenging, young adult life, like early childhood and through school years. And then when I went to college, I kind of learned how to fight with words, and I studied philosophy, Western philosophy. And then I came back and taught at the high school where I had gone to, where I had attended. And as I was doing that, I got put in on an emergency credential, meaning I had no formal training in how to be a teacher. So here I am with a philosophy degree, right? Super shy, super insecure, just a touch older than some of the students I'm teaching. And I'm in front of this class of ESL students, English as a second language, who are also immigrants. Difference being I had emigrated from an English-speaking country, from England. And so I was aware of that difference in our power and our privilege. And I had, educational privilege as well. But there were so many similarities. I was like, wow, these young people are so much like what I was, just a few years ago, and they don't know quite where they are or who they are, and they're being made to feel like they're stupid or they're wrong because of their culture, but their culture holds so much richness. And so we began this whole process of they weren't doing their homework. They didn't care about school. School was a joke, right? They could see through this facade. And so they're like, Miss, if you want us to do our homework, why don't you hit us? Because in some of the countries that they had come from in Eastern Europe or, like South America, that was what would happen. And I looked at them, I was like, if I did that here, I would get fired. They're like, yeah, it wouldn't have worked anyway. We just wear extra pants to stop the sting of the stick. And then we got into, and it was my greatest education, this really real relationship where I said, well, okay, so this isn't working. What can I do? What can we do together that would be meaningful for you? What do you want to learn? We threw out the whole syllabus that had been planned of like remedial reading and blah, blah, blah. And I said, we want to learn about the American dream because that's why we're here. And our reality, the American nightmare, and why it is so messed up, and what can we do to be powerful and to succeed. And so we began this huge inquiry, and then they started coming to class and doing the homework. And I realized in that moment that all learning comes from the inside out. Someone can't force us to take something on. It has to really matter to us. And so I myself then was in my own version of a little bit what they were going through. I was in school to become a teacher, to get the actual teacher qualifications to do what I was doing anyway in my day job. And most of my teacher ed classes were really boring and like jumping through hoops and not interesting. And I went into this technology class, and the teacher was an older Asian man. And, my dad is a Asian man, a computer science professor. So it's like, oh, okay, I know this role. I know what's going to happen here. And we're going to learn, going to be another meaningless class. And the teacher said, all right, any topic that you want to explore, like if you could do an exploration of your dream topic, anything you want at all, brainstorm for me 3 things that you would study. And he was like, just listed out like cooking in Italian, or, how to parachute without having a tandem buddy. He listed some various things he was interested in. And I couldn't believe it. I just stopped and looked at him and thought, wow, really? Like, really, you're giving us this freedom? And my list was, I wanted to learn about Gandhian nonviolent revolution and social change, Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, like really learn, not just the way that it gets glossed in school every year around Martin Luther King Day. And so I wrote my list, and I thought, he's never going to approve, really, I'm going to get to do this in a technology class. And he approved every single project, and all we had to do was make a really detailed PowerPoint, because he wanted to teach us how to use PowerPoint, such a useful skill, right? And so I spent that whole semester diving into all of Gandhi's writings, Martin Luther King's letters, the lesser known speeches that he gave, really trying to understand the mechanics of social change and how it happens. And so that was what brought together the final piece for me of like, I had suffered, like many people suffer at the hands of systemic oppression, but I didn't have the tools to understand how to liberate myself until I got to do that study of those who had come before us and who had struggled and shown us the way. And that really, for me, became the beginning of when I started to live yoga in action.
I love that so much. Thank you for sharing that story with us. I mean, it does speak so poignantly to this, the knowing that like nothing that we're doing now is original. Nothing is new. It's all been done before. And isn't that so great that we get to learn from the people who've come before us, that we don't have to try to like, create something new. We can use what's been what's been given to us, sort of thing. I think we live in a culture where everything has to be so innovative, so new, like how to use yoga in all these cool new ways, and let's do acro yoga, and let's do it, with hammocks, and now let's do, it's just so trendy and fun and new, and now let's do yoga with beer, and let's do yoga in vineyards, and let's do yoga and all these things, that we forget that, like, actually the root of it is quite simple.
Yes, it's so simple.
Should come back to that simplicity.
That's right. And the tools, we forget this so much. It's like our indigenous elders, all of us, they were healers. There have been natural healers all through civilization, and they didn't have advanced degrees or certifications, or, they were just doing what made the most sense or what had been passed down to them. And so when we try to add on all these new like gimmicks and innovations, really, to me, it's actually often, and I even at different times, I'm, looking back, it's like I tried various things or was in that space in this way or that way. And it's actually disconnecting us from what is our heritage. And so I often say in yoga, we need to lean back as we are growing forward. We need to lean back to the roots of the practice, back to the heart of these teachings, back to the culture and the context from which it has come to us.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I have a question for you on something. When I talk about yoga appropriation with people, some of the big questions that I receive, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, is, a lot of people say, well, actually, yoga was brought from India to the United States. A lot of these big yogis came and brought the teachings here. And so how can we be appropriating it if it was brought here on their own volition? And I, of course, understand that it's appropriative in the sense that because yoga, Ayurveda, it was deemed illegal in India when the British, the Brits came over and colonized India. And so the fact that now we get this luxury of practicing something that was illegal in their own country, that right there is appropriative. But what is the kind of way that we can look at, even though yoga was brought here to the West, doesn't necessarily mean that now we get to do whatever we want with it?
Yes, that's a great question. I'm glad you're asking that, because it's true. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around cultural appropriation. And it's not that we're saying, you can't have this and this is ours. It's not really about that. It's more to understand the context. And so I like to break down cultural appropriation as two things. One, an imbalance of power, like a power dynamic. And then two, from within that power dynamic, a place where harm is caused. And so, for example, even though, some of these wonderful teachers brought yoga to the West, starting with the World Fair, the Parliament of World Religions, even before the 19th century, right at the end of the 1800s, and then continuing on through the middle of the 20th century, they were bringing a practice that had been, well, there's two parts to it. One is they were reacting to colonization, and so they were bringing a practice to the U.S. out of a context of colonized India. So during the time that many of these teachers were here, India was still under British colonial rule. And so, as with many situations when there's an oppressive power, the folks who are experiencing the oppression both internalize some of it and then also develop strategies to rebel. And so some amount of the way that yoga was taught here was, in fact, a reaction to colonization. So I think keeping that in mind is really, really important. And just knowing that maybe what we've gotten or what we see is just the tip of the iceberg, and that there's so much more that we may not know. But let's get back to power and harm, right? So there was recently an article by, I think it was Unpack, and I can send it to you, that conservatively estimated the amount of wealth that the British and other colonizers extracted from India, but mainly the British during the time of occupation, being something like $45 trillion.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that's not just wealth that mattered then. That's a legacy. You know, we think of India, and if you think of going there, I think everyone, it's like we have that trope, that stereotype of the poor begging people, you know, and children, and it's so heart-wrenching. And that poor backwards country that still hasn't gotten it together, even though the people are so happy and they're so wealthy in joy. But it's like, well, sure, they may have a spiritual practice and a deep, powerful practice, but that poverty is not accidental. You know, that is poverty that is part of a system of colonization. And so when we who are in positions of power, and I include myself in this as someone who lives in the global north, right? Someone with the power of the dollar, someone who has a lot of privilege in relationship to folks in the global south. When we then say, I'm going to go and do this thing, or I'm going to take this practice like yoga that has come from this other culture and this other country, we actually, and I'm going to profit off it, we may cause harm to those who are there if we're not careful, if we're not thinking about what we're doing. Because we can often simplify and glamorize and kind of make we chant and we say Om and we, say Namaste and other things. Or we can sterilize and like really exclude all of the cultural elements from the practice. This is no Om yoga, and both of those things take out the heart of what makes yoga as coming from a place and a people. And so I think the big thing with cultural appropriation is owning our power and our privilege, and then also seeing where we can do less harm, reduce harm, and even uplift and support those from whom this practice comes, right? So concrete ways to do that would be go learn actual yogic teachings. So have a teacher who understands the texts, who can impart what some of the nuances and different meanings of, say, the Bhagavad Gita are, which is a much lesser known yogic text than, say, the Yoga Sutras. But a wonderful teacher who can teach on that too is great. Or go and see if there's a yoga workshop or a conference. If you can ask the organizers if there aren't any South Asian teachers, where are the teachers? Where are the Indian teachers? Do you have, or if you know Indian teachers, South Asian teachers, Black teachers in the context of the US, uplift them, bring them in. That's part of what this is about, is giving back that platform to those for whom it has been taken away. Yeah.
I think that's beautiful. And, something that I was thinking about when you were talking is that, yoga is so rooted in deep, beautiful, philosophical and religious teachings. It's a way of life. It's a way of seeing things. And, in the US, there's such an aversion for so many people around those concepts because of the damage that Christianity and Catholicism has done on our psyche. And so, I can understand people kind of shying away and wanting to distance themselves from the philosophies of yoga and choosing instead just to do the physical practice. And so it's a challenging space of like reaching people where they're at and honoring that as they do the practice, they will, open up to something more. And also not wanting to strip the practice out of the very important roots that it comes from, or else we're, essentially colonizing the practice and causing harm, perpetuating harm.
That's right. It's true. And it is messy and it is nuanced. And I don't think this is why there's not one right answer, right? Yeah. Why none of us can write the book, the folks who work on this stuff, none of us can write the book or give the talk or the manual on if you do X, that's appropriation. If you do Y, that's not, because it's actually about critical thinking, and it's about, in my mind, skillful means, right? Yoga itself, I mean, this is my belief about it. It's alive. It has a consciousness of its own. It's about unity. It came to us. It came through, right? Not from one person. And it is here in the United States and in the West as well. In order for so many of us to learn from that consciousness, that way of yoga, and to really ask ourselves, is what I'm practicing creating more unity, creating more oneness, or is it creating more separation? And to use these tools that we have been given to be more and more critical and more critically loving as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I think I just needed to hear that. And I think everyone needs to hear that a lot, that it is so nuanced, that it requires critical thinking, that there is not one answer. Because if there were, then there wouldn't really be a problem, would there? We would just go to that answer. The fact of the matter is, this is an individual and collective question that we have to keep asking ourselves, and slowly guiding our way towards something that feels good, and knowing that what feels good is going to change. My journey of yoga has gone through so many ups and downs. And right now I'm kind of really distanced myself from the practice and from the physical practice, and because I have a lot of body stuff going on. But I found a way to connect to yoga, through a more spiritual practice, through a more meditation practice, and letting that be enough. And I have been confronted many times with, as a white woman in America, like, how can I, allow myself the gift that these spiritual practices have given me? Yoga has healed, yoga saved me. Without yoga, I would have gone through so much more pain. And really honoring that and grounding myself in that, and also acknowledging that the yoga in which kind of I surrounded myself with was very appropriative in many ways. And having that, holding that tension and being in that tension.
Absolutely. And I think that's so wonderful, actually, that you're sharing a little bit about your own personal journey with the practice, and also that you named your yoga practice as meditation and some other aspects of yoga, because for me, that's a big part of my mission, I feel like, is to help share the knowledge that yoga is so much more than the poses. And it's so much deeper, dhyana, dharana, samadhi. It's like mindfulness, concentration, insight, meditation, and bliss. And these are, of course, perhaps more or developed practices, but that doesn't mean that we can't access them moment to moment and then cultivate different tools to get us back there. So I'm really curious if you could share a little bit about your practice or where you're at now with it.
Yeah, well, I have a deep connection to Hanuman, and I do a lot of chanting practices. The Hanuman Chalisa, I chant every day in my meditation. I have, I think, like 7 Hanumans on my altar alone. So really connecting with, Hanuman, to me anyway, represents just a sense of humility, and almost a castration, almost like a complete letting go of self in honor of something bigger. And to me, that something bigger is love, is a deep connection and reverence to love, to oneness, to a sense of wholeness that I believe exists in all of us. So my practice changes every day, and I allow it to change every day, but it typically includes a chanting component, a meditation component, a journaling component. And I miss the asana practice tremendously, but because of some of my physical stuff, I've had to do yoga of letting go of the asana practice. And what I find is that so much of why I'm as hurt as I am is because I really fell into the really tantalizing narrative that I think many people perpetuate in the yoga industry, that if you are flexible and skinny and white and can fit in these really cute yoga clothes, and you can be really bendy and you can do yoga in all these places and take photos of it, then that means something, right? It means a level of enlightenment. It means that you're closer to something. It's a lifestyle. The yoga lifestyle lie is so tantalizing. And I fell into it 100%. I was in my early 20s. I wanted nothing more than to be perceived as perfect to compensate for the brokenness that I was feeling,
Oh my gosh. I'm so grateful to you for sharing this, because Thais, it's like, I think this is the side that no one wants to say, right? Like, why is it so captivating to us? Why do we want that? Well, it's because it carries so much power, and there's all of us out here like, yoga is for everybody, everyone can, but the truth is, it's seductive, and
Yes.
it's seductive to be flexible. It's seductive to think that we can attain a certain body, whatever, like standard of beauty or standard of flexibility. And we compare ourselves inside our own minds. So, like, I feel like sometimes even in an asana class, I notice the comparison still, right? All these years. And I still catch myself like, oh, my arm isn't as high as that person on the mat next to me. And it's like, right. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So, but that's so key, is that we have that drive. And why is it there? Like, why is it there in us?
Yeah. And naming that it's tantalizing, naming that it's very easy to fall victim to that world, I think is important to name, because in many ways, we're victims to a culture that really attempts to sell a narrative of what a woman in our culture should look like. And it's as white and skinny and able body and college educated. And it's like put together and meditates every day and drinks green juices and can spend all her money on Whole Foods. And, there is a narrative, and it's tantalizing. And being able to name that, I think, is important in order for us to then recognize that that goal is an illusion. It's not going to actually offer anything of substance. It's actually not going to take away our pain. Getting closer to the patriarchal narrative that's going to save us is a lie. And we have to talk about that.
Yes. And this is great, because you're just reminding me, I think I often think so much about race and about constructs of imperialism, which really, cultural appropriation is just a nice way of saying an imperialist tool, right, of empire and control by one group over another. But I forget, or just put less focus on those systems that we also exist within, of sexism, of patriarchy, and that if we're not careful, we can believe the lie that all the ads tell us, something like we see somewhere between 3 and 10,000, 20,000 ads a day right now. And all of those ads, or many of them, are saying, you're not enough, you're not worthy, your body isn't the right kind of body, do this, that, buy this thing, buy that thing to fulfill yourself and make yourself better. And that, it's like we have to it sounds almost trivial, but I don't think it is. In the same way that in the Indian independence movement, Gandhi used the word Swaraj, so Swa, self, Raj, rule, self-rule. And he understood that Indians had to overcome that internalized oppression of feeling inferior, of adopting British norms like top hats and suits. And so he spun his own cloth, right? His homespun. So when you have an image of Gandhi, you imagine him with that like simple cotton khadi cloth, and that was not an accident. It wasn't just like the style choice of a guru, it was like, this is a really intentional choice to say, I'm not buying into the lie that says only a man in a suit and a hat is a reputable man to be listened to. I am powerful. I am strong, and I am strong in a different kind of way. And I think it's that same Swaraj that we are actually trying to cultivate when we practice yoga in a way that allows us to see the illusion of, an Instagram, like a typical Instagram yogi that just is there for the poses, right? Like a gorgeous dancer pose on the beach or on a rock. That the illusion is that they're no closer to freedom, and in fact, perhaps further away.
Yes. I'm so glad that you're speaking to this, Susanna. I'm so glad that you're doing this work, because it gives me so much hope that the yoga industry can go back to its roots, and that that's not a loss, that's a gain, that's going to offer this beautiful practice and way of life to to more people. It's going to be accessible for more people if we stop, kind of putting our attention onto the 5 people who are skinny and showing their yoga poses on Instagram, because that is perpetuating a narrative, and we get to decide how we want to participate in our culture. We are culture makers. And I'm so glad that you said that. And to wrap up this call, I would love to hear, like, what are some things that we can be doing? I know you mentioned some things in the conversation, but if there's anything else that we could be doing to help decolonize yoga and to bring yoga back to its roots, what would they be?
Yes. So I really like to, one, invite us to seek out those true teachers, and that can be through books, it can be through texts, it can also be through in-depth study. And so if we're going to be practicing yoga, to really try to go to a source that we feel is a true teacher for us. And again, no one can give you the rules on what that looks like, but I think and then one of the clues is, are they teaching the full spectrum of what yoga can be, right? Like all the limbs, a tapas practice, a practice of ethics. And so, as I mentioned, finding a teacher, I think it's important to acknowledge that sometimes teachers can abuse their power, right? So if it's a teacher who's saying, my way is the only way, only do what I say, that is perhaps a moment to pause. So I'm not inviting for us to give up our, in philosophy, we call it like epistemology, our epistemic determinacy, our ability to understand and name our own reality. I'm not saying give that up. I'm just saying seek out a valuable teacher and connect with the deeper teachings. So reading the text with them, studying the texts, and putting the fuller scope of the practice of yoga into being. And so for me, a huge way of doing that is the yoga ethics, which, one of my root teacher comes from the tradition of Shankaracharya, who was teaching kind of in the medieval period in India. And he's an Advaita Vedanta practitioner, meaning he's non-dual. There's no separation between you and I, but self and other. There's just no such separation. And at the same time, he saw that where Indian culture was at that time, it really needed ethical teachings and practice to move to the understanding of oneness. And I think we are, as my teacher teaches me, we are at that time as well, where we need to practice our ethics. And so whether that's, ahimsa, non-harming, satya, truthfulness, brahmacharya, energy management, finding and putting into practice ways of doing those very, both simple but so challenging practices of ethics, of bringing our yoga off the mat and into the entirety of our lives, so that we don't say, oh, I'm going to yoga. It sounds really pretentious to say, oh, I'm being yoga. I am yoga, but cultivating more of that spirit of I am here. I am present. I am doing the very best that I can do to be in unity with myself, with others, and with the entire world.
Oh, I love that so much. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today, and for all of your thoughts, your work. I appreciate you endlessly. And I will be making sure to put on the show notes all of the links to all of the things so people can find you and support you in your work. Thank you, Susanna, so much.
You're so welcome. And is it okay if I share one thing that
Yes,
because
go
it
for
might
it.
be interesting to your audience? It'll be happening in the summer. I'm planning on doing an Instagram challenge that
Okay.
seeks to subvert our understanding of Instagram yoga. And so, if folks want to find me on my website and get, like, I have some ways that they can do more to honor yoga on there, you'll also hear about that challenge. I think it's going to be really thought-provoking and experimental. And I don't know if at the end of the day we will say, "Oh, this failed." We could not use Instagram as a medium and a means to practice more depth in our yoga, but I want us to try. So I'm excited for that.
I love it. Yes, I will share the crap out of it. That is so exciting. And I'll definitely add, the info as it comes up on the show notes for people, as well as your Instagram handle so that people can learn about it the minute it comes out.
Well, this is such a great conversation. I'm so, so grateful to you for having me on and for all of the work that you're doing and for this opportunity to connect with you and all your amazing community.
Thank you. Thank you so much.